I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Anna Francis. Anna is an artist and a curator and one of the directors of Airspace Gallery in Stoke-on-Trent. She's also the course leader for fine art at Staffordshire University, where she's based in Stoke, and as part of her curatorial practice, recently curated Indefinable Cities, an exhibition of UK and Japanese artists which also travelled to 5 different cities across Japan. Before we get started, just in case to make sure I don't forget to say this at the end, just to invite you all to the next Facets, which is on February the 25th. That's the evening of the launch of the New Art West Midlands exhibition here at the Herbert. So rather than starting at the usual 4:30, that next one, you're invited to come at 4:30. You'll be the very first people to have a sneak peek of the exhibition. The talk will be a panel discussion, including one of this year's selectors, Sonia Boyce, and that will be from 5 until 6. And then you're all invited to stay for the private view of the Herbert section of the New Art West Midlands exhibition. So that's the next Facets on the 25th of February. But for today, we are delighted to welcome Anna.
Thank you. Thanks, Michelle. Brilliant. So thanks ever so much for inviting me today. And I've had a really nice day so far talking to everyone, and thank you to those people who shared your practice with me. It's my turn. So yes, I've already been introduced, so some of the roles I perform, and I thought it would be good to start by just drawing your attention to something which might be useful to some of you who are graduating soon. One of the things that I do quite a lot is supporting emerging artists and thinking about how to support graduates in the kind of early years out of university. And in that capacity, I put together this publication for Artist Newsletter, which was published in 2013. And I think you can all access Artist Newsletter, those of you who are students, via your Athens login by your library. So do write this down. This is a resource which is aimed at new artists, so those people who are just graduating, and it's full of top tips, things they didn't tell you at art school, and lots of toolkits and resources for those early years. Out of art school. So I just thought I would share that with you. It's one of the things that I do, and I kind of do a bit of mentoring and things like that alongside. But I think importantly to me, I'm also an artist as well as those other roles. And I use a number of different methods and materials in my practice, but something which I do quite a lot is around thinking about the role of artists and arts organisations in cities and in places, and how cities and places develop and what our role is within that development. And I use lots of tools, but something which is really central to my practice, and I think you'll see this as I talk through some of the projects I've done, is that everything is about kind of creating space for conversation with people. Those people are other artists and the public. Space to talk about places and how we work within them. And I guess one of the things I do quite a lot of is walking. In every project I do, there is an element of walking, and I've just kind of included some of the ways that perhaps I walk in my practice. Sometimes I might be walking as a kind of development tool, so walking with other artists, looking at a place. In other projects, I've been leading a tour, a kind of quite traditional tour, which will bring people to look at a place differently. And sometimes I might be in disguise as a tour guide or as an interrogator of space. And I also use walking as a way of kind of developing new skills in perhaps photography and also more traditional ways of exploring new places. So, for example, in 2013, I was commissioned with my partner to create a tour of the new Library of Birmingham via the books. At that point in time, my practice was looking a lot at birds in cities, and the tour that I created for the new Library of Birmingham was looking at literary birds, and created a kind of walking tour around the new library and taking people on a tour to talk about birds from books. And so that's kind of a traditional way of walking. But I would say I use walking as a way of understanding and observing a site. Most of my projects involve walking in some form, and I often start a project by walking. So I'll use it as a research tool to go and understand a place and just spend time walking in that place, and trying to understand who's using the place and how, and what's there, and as a kind of way of kind of mapping resources of a place. But also walking can be an outcome in my practice quite a lot. So actually the artwork, the resulting artwork, can be a walk. So as I talk through some of my projects, I think you'll see that conversation is really key, and also walking. I also make quite a lot of multiples. A lot of my practice is kind of is temporary and is performative, and in that way often it only lasts a short period of time. So thinking about, you know, what's left afterwards is really kind of key. So I make a lot of multiples which go alongside my projects. So in the past I've made a lot of badges and a lot of postcards and lots of other types of multiple. This solves a number of kind of purposes. It's good because it kind of, as I said, it leaves a trace of your project, but it's also really good to have something to give out to people, something that they've got to remember you by. And as I've said here, you know, that's really even more important when works are kind of intervention or temporary in nature. And I think it's great to have this kind of accumulation of things as an artist which kind of document your projects via these kind of small things. But sometimes my multiples can be edible. So this is from a project which I did during the Manchester International Festival in 2011. I was invited to do a residency in what was called the Burlington Fine Arts Club, which was an interesting project where people could sign up and pay to be a member of this club, which was an art club, which also had a kind of drinking ethos behind it as well, and brought artists to the city of Manchester during Manchester International Festival. They talked to me a lot about the fact that Manchester International Festival, as this really big project, which was kind of bringing people to Manchester from all over the world, didn't really connect much with the ecology, the kind of grassroots ecology of the arts in Manchester. So artists working in Manchester didn't feel well connected into that big project happening on their doorstep. So I was really interested in that, how something which could be seen as a real kind of cultural regenerator wasn't necessarily impacting on those working in the city on the ground. So my project for the Burlington was to go and visit a lot of the Manchester International Festival projects, and I created a kind of evaluation tool for those projects, and each kind of point on the evaluation corresponded to a drink ingredient, and then I kind of ticked off which things they'd hit as I visited. And so each of the projects in Manchester International Festival ended up with its own cocktail. I then hosted an evening where artists from Manchester came and drank cocktails and were able to talk to me about the projects in the festival via a cocktail. So it was a kind of a big ruse as a way of kind of talking to artists about how they felt about Manchester and the festival with cocktails. Sort of interesting to think about performative works like this. I think I learnt quite a lot that actually sometimes the spectacle of your work can kind of overtake the kind of primary reason behind the work. So with this, I think the cocktails were a bit distracting from the conversation, and also it was quite hard work making lots of cocktails when you're not, you know, really a cocktail waitress. So over the years, I've employed characters quite a lot in my practice. I've been a dating agency director where I created a dating agency for artists and their artworks as a way of curating a show and putting artists together and pairing their work and showing their work. And I've been a holiday rep outside the Turner Contemporary when they'd just opened, and I created a Wheel of Fortune which said things like, "You will let us down, you will teach us to sing again." And people from the public would spin the wheel, and then it would be a way to talk about how they felt about Turner and what Turner might do for Margate, which is where the Turner was opening. I've been a tour guide for Stoke-on-Trent, taking people on regeneration tours of the city, and I've been an agony aunt, a regeneration agony aunt, where I created a chat show And I've also been a chambermaid who was also an arts curator in a hotel who cleaned the hotel at the same time as representing artists on my chambermaid trolley. So that project was thinking about what we as artists do and the roles we perform. And a lot of what I do is around considering the role of the artist, as I mentioned. And I wanted to show you kind of these different characters that I employ, because I think over the years I developed all of these different characters as a kind of variety of ways of talking to people about different subject matters. But I think I found that the characters themselves were kind of quite distracting in the work, and become a bit too large for life, and I've kind of moved away from that now, because I think they were, as I was kind of starting out on my practice, they gave me a lot of confidence to talk to people and gave me license to talk about things which may have been more difficult for me as an artist, as myself. But I now feel that, perhaps sometimes they were a bit distracting, so I don't use them as much in my work anymore. One of the other things that I found to be really useful in kind of moving my practice on is in kind of visiting other places, and I really recommend taking time to do residencies as you're starting out on your practice, and applying for residencies in different countries. I think it's really important to kind of test your work in new contexts and see, how your work fits in those new contexts. And I've been lucky to have done quite a lot of residencies all over the place. But I think the most interesting one for me was the residency I did in Japan in 2012. And I talked to some of you this morning about that residency. This was a really interesting rural residency in the Nara Mountains of Japan, where, as I mentioned, they have a real problem with farming life in Japan really kind of dying out, and they're really struggling to kind of get younger people involved in farming. So there's lots of abandoned farmhouses in rural areas, and there's quite a lot of arts initiatives which bring artists to kind of look at that context and think about what role arts might perform in regenerating and kind of rethinking these places. So I went to do this residency at Headspace, artist residency program in Japan. But I guess when I go to a place like this, which is very different to my base in Stoke-on-Trent, a kind of post-industrial city, you couldn't get much further away somewhere like this. I'm still thinking about my context and the way that I work, and then looking to learn from this new this kind of new program of arts in rural areas in Japan and thinking how it's relevant. So I guess finding correlation even in kind of quite different places. So while I was in Japan, I did quite a lot of reading and quite a lot of thinking, but I also learnt some Japanese ikebana. Does everyone know what Japanese ikebana is? So ikebana is flower arranging, and you will kind of recognise Japanese flower arranging. It always has quite striking choice of vessel and vase, and really beautiful flowers, and there are very strict kind of structures for how the flowers go into the vessel. So while I was in Japan, I was really interested to pick up some of that skill, but I was always thinking back to my base back in Stoke-on-Trent. So in Stoke-on-Trent, I don't know how much, or if anyone's been to Stoke-on-Trent, but Stoke-on-Trent is a post-industrial city where we have a lot of empty space at the moment. So the industry in Stoke lasted quite a lot longer than quite a lot of other places in the UK, but what it's meant is that our kind of decline is much more recent. So we still have lots of undeveloped brownfield land around the city and right in the city centre where factories and buildings have been knocked down, and we have these kind of fallow brownfield sites. And this one is right next to Airspace Gallery, where I'm a director and where I have my studio. This is a really public space which is in between Tesco's and our gallery, where the ABC Cinema used to be. The ABC Cinema was right in the middle of the council's cultural quarter, but was knocked down to make an entrance into the Tesco supermarket. So you can see that's quite a kind of political thing to have happened, that a cinema in a cultural quarter can be knocked down for a supermarket. I think that's really interesting. And this brownfield site has been there ever since, and for many years nobody would admit to owning it, and it was a really interesting site for me, to kind of watch it grow from just rubble and then see these plants growing on there. So while I was in Japan, I was thinking about this site and thinking about what the purpose of this site might be in a city like Stoke-on-Trent. So I was making a plan, picking up these kind of skills in Ikebana with the idea of visiting some brownfield sites really close to the gallery. So within 5 minutes walk from airspace, there's the ABC Cinema site, and there's a number of other brownfield sites. This one is where an abattoir was knocked down about 3 years ago. And this site is actually really rich and abundant, and I don't know whether it's because there was a lot of blood and bone kind of around the area, but very quickly there were things like dragonflies and really quite diverse plants growing on this site. And then this was my third site, which was originally a greyhound track, which was a real kind of working class pastime, and lots of people in Stoke kept and still do keep greyhounds. But the greyhound site is the oldest of the 3 sites, and has been kind of fallow and kind of left for about 10 years. So my thoughts were, instead of these kind of really beautiful vessels that the Japanese would use, I would kind of go to the sites and collect some of the rubbish from the site, and then I would kind of be interested to see what different sort of plants, weeds are growing on the site, and would kind of collect those. So I'm looking to make seen the kind of the real kind of abundant, rich nature haven that these sites are while they're brownfield. So in cities, obviously it's really important to have a kind of a healthy ecology, and actually if we start to recognise that these could really contribute to that without much management, we could really kind of rethink what these sites are for. And so my project with the Brownfield Ikebana was to kind of rethink and try to kind of consider the beauty in these sites. So I take the bits of rubbish that I collect back to the gallery, and using the kind of rules of Ikebana, where you have kind of, well, there's lots of different structures that you can use, but the one I used quite often is where there are 3 main lines which represent heaven, earth and man, and then there are kind of smaller lines in between, which are supporting lines. And then so using those, I will create an Ikebana, but using weeds and rubbish. I mentioned that I'm quite kind of interested in kind of bringing other people into my work, and I often create a works instruction to go alongside the projects that I do, which make really visible my process and make it kind of make it easy for other people to kind of replicate what I'm doing. So most works will have some kind of works instruction or some kind of toolkit for people to use. And that is really important for me, that I'm kind of opening the conversation out to other people and kind of getting them to think, you know, could I use this tool to rethink my space? So alongside that, when I was doing the Brownfield Ikebana project, I also invited people to come and undertake a Brownfield Ikebana workshop with me. So people came to the gallery and kind of visited the site with me, and I showed them how to collect the vessels and how to recognise some of the more beautiful bits of rubbish, and then we would collect the plants and then return to the gallery in order to create some of the Brownfield Ikebana. So these are some of the participants' Ikebana from one of the workshops, and you can see, I think, that they have kind of transformed something, you know, that's just discarded into something quite beautiful and stunning. So yes, that was in 2012, and I was asked to kind of revisit that project last year. So in 2015, I returned to the 3 sites, which I was really pleased to do, to kind of see how they developed further, to see, you know, has the ecology changed there, and, you know, is anything changing? And it was really interesting for me to go and revisit and see how, you know, the plants in 2012 on the ABC site, which were kind of this big, are now this big. And in places are just thick and you can't even walk through. And the greyhound track is actually a really there's loads of edible plants growing on there. There's strawberries and blackberries, and that site is really quite mature now. But the abattoir site has been developed, so most of the abattoir site is now a Premier Inn, and there is still a tiny little section that is probably never going to be developed because it's too small, but is still very rich and abundant. So I'll just show you some of my ikebana from 2015. So this is the cinema ikebana, and this is the greyhound track ikebana, and this is the abattoir ikebana. So, sort of interesting to see the kind of variations. And this was shown at Sison Gallery in Nottingham in an exhibition which was looking at how artists are using flowers. It was a challenge for me because I had to take my ikebana on the train. So, and it was interesting to see how it kind of fared over a week-long exhibition. So, yeah. I displayed the 2015 ikebana, and then I also displayed postcards for people to take of the ones from before. So to kind of share my process with you a little bit, I often employ what is recognised in kind of social sciences as an action research process. So I mentioned that I often start when I'm working on a new space by kind of spending time there and looking. And that looking can be about walking the site and just kind of making an ecology report. But it's also about kind of looking at the history of the site, who has used it before and who cares about it and who has a stake in that site now. After that, I spend some time planning and thinking about what my intervention might be. And I think quite often in the projects that I do, I look for gaps. So I look for where nobody else is kind of interested or where something isn't quite working. And my plan is often based on one of those gaps. At that point, I then kind of, carry out my action and then spend some time reflecting on that action, and then perhaps the process might start again. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of share that with you and then show you a project which really kind of used that cycle quite visibly, I think. So the next project I want to talk about is the Spode Rose project. Sorry, I'll just grab a quick drink of water. So I mentioned that as well as being an artist, I'm also a director at Airspace Gallery, and we have a gallery programme, so we have exhibitions in the gallery, and some of those I curate, and then sometimes we have other curators coming in. But we're really keen that our projects don't just kind of remain in the gallery, they also kind of get out into the city and start to kind of, I think we see the projects that we do out of the gallery as kind of our kind of testing ground, and then we kind of theorise on those projects back in the gallery space. So the project, the Spode Rose project, I'll just tell you a bit of a background. Spode Rose project was within, how many of you have heard of the British Ceramics Biennial? Have you heard of that? Some of you, yeah? Good. So Stoke-on-Trent is known for pottery, and every 2 years we host the British Ceramics Biennial in the city, which brings lots of ceramic artists and ceramicists and ceramic companies to the city to showcase ceramic in all of its sort of different forms. And at Airspace Gallery, we always show some kind of quite immersive installation in our space. We usually work with an artist to kind of come in and talk about how an artist uses ceramics. So this, for example, was our 2013 exhibition, where we worked with Corinne Felgate, who is a really fantastic artist based in London. She came to the city and she likened the kind of collapse of the pottery industry and the many sort of pottery factories that have just been kind of mothballed to Pompeii, where this sudden event happened and it's almost like things froze in time. And the installation she did in the gallery was kind of based on those ideas. So through the years, Airspace has always hosted a kind of immersive installation in the gallery. And in 2013, we decided we wanted to try a few extra things outside the gallery. In 2012, we also started to develop an interest in gardens as a space, mainly because our backyard at the gallery was often used by artists coming and doing residencies, and also by our studio artists upstairs. And it was a rat run because Tesco's is just on the other side of the wall there, and we would just have lots of rats running through all the time. And it was a bit of an eyesore. So we decided to kind of use that action research wheel, and we looked at the space and saw who was using the space, and actually it was mainly birds that used the space as well as our artists. So we decided to develop a garden at the back of Airspace, which was called the Birdyarden. So everything in the garden is there to support bird life, whether that be for sort of food or nesting materials. So in 2012 we developed our first garden, and we really kind of found that actually the skills of an artist translate quite well into sort of landscape design, even if we're not really that well kind of skilled in it. The BCB, the British Ceramics Biennial exhibition, happens at the old Spode factory. So Spode was a massive site with hundreds and hundreds of workers, which actually closed in, I think it was 2010, so it was quite recent that space closed, and the British Ceramics Biennial used their massive hall for their main exhibition. And so the public, every 2 years, come through this little garden space into the factory, and we noticed that they were walking through this kind of abandoned garden, which this abandoned garden used to be a really well-loved garden where all the workers used to go and have their lunch. And at some point in its history, somebody had worked on this garden and turned it into a rose garden, which this was our looking process, kind of told us about that kind of history. So this is how it looked, quite overgrown and neglected, and they had 32,000 visitors to the BCB in 2011. So you can imagine this is what they're walking through. It's kind of a bit of an odd thing. So we thought, maybe we need to be thinking about doing something with this space. And we can use our kind of skills as artists here and kind of utilise this history and heritage of the garden as a rose garden to develop something. At the same time, the BCB was working with the Stoke-on-Trent City Council to develop the Chelsea Flower Show garden that they got loads of bad press for, because the council spent loads of money sending this garden to London while closing lots of things in the city. But it was quite a beautiful garden, and the BCB worked with them to create the bottle oven shape there that you see, and they made thousands and thousands of these ceramic bricks. So while we were working within the Spode factory, there was a whole army of people making ceramic flowers at the same time. So we were thinking about this garden space, and there were lots of these ceramic flowers being made, and we kind of put those things together, and we started to think about what we could do with this garden space. We didn't have the resources to develop the garden space because we didn't have funding to do that. So we decided that we would just develop a triangle of the garden. We would just choose one bit of the garden and we would make a development there. And so it would just be this bit, this small triangle that was cleaned up and developed, and the rest would still be kind of messy. So we decided to work with Rita Floyd. So we do quite a lot of collaborating with different people with different skills. Rita Floyd is a ceramic flower maker who was employed by Adderley Pottery since she was 15 to create things like this. And she was made redundant when the factory closed. And then she had been employed by the British Ceramics Biennial to work on these bricks. And we thought this is really interesting. This is quite similar to how we work. The BCB are kind of recognising a resource and a skill and something which is potentially really beautiful, but which is being overlooked or kind of left behind, and they're kind of rethinking it and reusing it in a modern context. So we asked Rita if she could make us a beautiful ceramic rose, which we would use as a kind of emblem for that garden that we talked about. We then decided it would be really good to work with a rose breeder as well, and to try and get this ceramic rose turned into a real life living rose. So we visited a couple of rose breeders, and this is one of the rose breeders, Warner's Roses, that we visited. And we learnt a lot about how roses get bred, and it's really interesting. It's an 8-year process, and you can kind of put a pink rose with a white rose, but you may get, you know, something completely different, a yellow rose out of that. You know, it's really kind of a bit random. And we kind of took a ceramic rose with us that Rita Floyd had made for us to the rose breeders, in the hope that they might have something similar, because we didn't have 8 years to try and create one from scratch. But the way rose breeders work is that they will have fields full of kind of test roses. So this is actually Fryer's Roses, whose family, this is Gareth Fryer, whose family have been breeding roses for 100 years. And he is a rose breeder, and he'll have sort of 5 of each bush, and they'll be growing over 8 years to see whether pests kind of leave them alone and which ones are kind of the strongest. And we took our ceramic rose to him and said, we're looking for a really strong scented English type rose. And luckily, it turned out he had a perfect one. It was called something like T103. And at that point, we kind of talked to him about then raising the funds to pay him to name that rose the Spode China Rose. So our plan all along was to kind of take that rose back into the garden in our little triangle development, and longer term be able to kind of install the roses into the garden and show people that if there was a will, we could all kind of create and rework this garden for the future. So in December 2014, we returned to Fryer's to pick up the first 10 rose bushes. So he had to do the process of growing on more for us, enabling us to do that. And then in summer 2015, we created a new flower bed in the garden and did another triangle and installed some of the rose bushes in there ahead of the BCB. And then we also, this doesn't show it, but we also did a lot of other planting around it and companion planting. And it's at this stage, actually, that the city council kind of became aware of what we were doing. They own the site, and we also showcased the project at a show at the New Art Gallery Walsall Small Worlds show. It was really interesting for us because we had to install a live rose bush in the gallery, which has kind of temperature control, and the rose bushes kept dying because they just didn't like it in there. We had to freeze the root, the soil and things like that. But yes, so at this stage we're kind of reflecting. We've kind of gone through the kind of, you know, looking and planning and acting, and now we're reflecting again via this exhibition, and then this new kind of physical change that we've made. Sort of led to the council, a councillor saying, what's going on with this garden? Why are there just these 2 bits developed? And so since then, the council has actually agreed to renovate the whole garden. So it's really interesting for us that our intervention has kind of made them have to make lasting change. So we're now working with the landscaping team from the council, and we're involving the community. We've done a kind of community consultation. And what we've learnt is that people really want to see the heritage of Spode represented in the garden. And we're now working on a plan which incorporates some of the Spode patterns into a new plan for the garden. And also our Spode rose will have kind of pride of place within the garden. So something that we did, we kind of thought about what our resources were, which wasn't much. And we thought we just focused on one intervention that would have quite kind of high impact, and hopefully it did then lead to kind of permanent change. So we're really keen that we build relationships with sites around us as a gallery, and we are able to kind of work with people to understand what their needs are, and that's a question we ask of people when we start working with them. You know, what do you need? So another project that we've just done recently was a bee-friendly garden in our local park. And this was the Women's Institute contacted us and asked us if we'd help them to spread some seeds. And at the same time, the Friends of Hanley Park, which is our local park, had said that they'd been trying to develop a nature garden in the park since 2010, but hadn't quite got anywhere with it. So we kind of put those 2 things together, and we did a project which was kind of supporting birds, and then there's been a lot in the press about the kind of dying out of bees. So, you know, we decided that we would create a bee-friendly garden for the park. So last summer we kind of got a team of volunteers together to come and start working with us in the local park, and we worked on a design which was a kind of big bee's head, and got people involved in thinking again about you know, plants which support bees throughout the year so that there's always nectar available. And then, yeah, that's what we spent our summer doing, kind of installing this bee-friendly garden. And then we had a kind of big launch with a kind of willow weaving, making willow flowers and bees. And the WI made cake, and we had a local beekeeper who came and kind of talked about honey and why we were there in the first place, which is all about bees. So kind of with these projects, I think as artists we can make interventions like this, which, you know, really raise the public's awareness and sometimes do lead to the council rethinking how they work with people and rethinking the role of green spaces in cities. But I just thought it'd be sort of useful to think about, you know, what skills we do have as artists, which are quite kind of, there's many. You know, we've got an ability to collaborate with people, creative thinking. We're all really good negotiators because we have to do that all the time as artists. And project management, all of you will be great at project management because you're always managing your own practice. Visual communication and how you start to kind of get the public engaged with the overlooked. An ability to recognise resources. I think we're all really well trained at that because we're good at kind of seeing things where other people just see kind of detritus or rubbish. An ability to make the invisible visible. We're also really all great documenters, and obviously documentation, especially with projects which are kind of intervention and temporary, that's your kind of currency later on with your projects. And also we always are reflecting and writing about our practice. So we kind of have a lot of skills. You'll see that my practice in more recent years is really moving towards thinking about urban nature. In 2014, I was commissioned to create an urban nature guide for the Saturday Market project. And I also kind of led tours around Shoreditch during London Design Festival, and it was quite interesting for me because I don't know Shoreditch at all, but the key that I created was using the language of flowers, the Victorian language of flowers, which I don't know if any of you know of the Victorian language of flowers, where every flower and a lot of weeds too have a meaning assigned to them. So I would use the kind of the meaning. So wild garlic meant courage and strength. So I would use the meaning as a kind of instruction to kind of to work in a space. And another project which I did recently was a Birder's Paradise bird hide, which is a caravan, as you can see, which was kind of turned into a mobile sort of nature lab, which visited lots of urban nature sites in the city. And kind of, again, it's about kind of bringing people to look differently at sites. And exploring sites via nature. But I suppose a lot of my work is about thinking about myself and my role as a citizen. So I think often when we talk about artists, we talk about artists as being kind of separate from society and these kind of aliens who aren't connected to anything. But in fact, we all live somewhere and we are all part of society, and I think that's really important to me. When I first started out making work about cities, my work was a lot to do with housing renewal. And back in 2006, I was really documenting some of the demolition that was happening, housing demolition around Stoke. And I mentioned this morning about the Pathfinder scheme, which was a really unpopular scheme that the government came up with, which kind of said that terraced houses were not really fit for modern families, and so a lot of housing across the UK was demolished. Because the regeneration schemes kind of ran out of money when the government changed, a lot of those projects collapsed, and we ended up with streets of houses that are still boarded up and lots more brownfield sites that haven't been developed. And in Stoke, that's a real issue. And so where I live now was an area where the council had decided they were going to demolish, but then they kind of ran out of money before they got round to it. So there was loads and loads of empty houses boarded up. This is my house. about 2.5 years ago. So this is a project that the council decided to do where they I don't know if you heard about it, it was called the £1 house scheme, where you could buy a house for £1. And I bought my house for £1. And at the time you had to say how you were going to help the community to develop. So it's really interesting for me that my kind of role as an artist is kind of now right in the front in this project. I think it's interesting that often, you know, we might be doing a residency somewhere elsewhere from where we live, or we might be going to do a commission somewhere else. And quite a lot of the projects that I talk about, I'm working with the public in their context, and I'm kind of this stranger artist coming in and kind of talking to them about where they live. And that kind of distance is really interesting, and you're able to kind of go home at the end of the day and be somebody else. But more recently, I've been working on my doorstep. So I was commissioned last year by the British Ceramics Biennial to do this project, Community Maker. And you know, all of those kind of things about being a kind of artist citizen, artist resident are now kind of right in the front of my thinking. So I mentioned the British Ceramics Biennial before. The project came back to this design. This is called the Homemaker, which was a pottery that was really kind of popular in the 50s. It was sold in Woolworths, and everyone had this. You might have seen it before. Enid Seeney was the first designer, female designer, to be trained at Spode Factory, which turned out to be a kind of strange coincidence because my project was shown in the Spode Factory in October. It also was a strange coincidence because it turned out that my partner's dad used to go out with Enid Seeney. That was a strange, weird coincidence. But the project was thinking about, the Homemaker project was, the Homemaker plate was when people's houses, people after the war started to be able to afford nice things in their houses again. So the Homemaker was kind of, these are the kind of things that you need to make a successful home. Well, my project, Community Maker, thinks about these houses, these £1 houses, on streets where there's been real hardship over the last few years because lots of people were moved out, and then there's been a lot of antisocial behaviour and drug problems in the area. And then you've brought this new kind of community of £1 homeowners in to this process. And so my project was thinking about what do you need to make a successful community. So Community Maker was all about that. The kind of first test for Community Maker was that there is no space in the area for the community to meet. There are some open spaces, but there's no pub because it's closed. There was no community centre, it was closed and still boarded up. All of the things that kind of are the places that communities usually work don't exist. So I had to kind of create a space with this tent, and then over the summer create opportunities for the community to get together and start to work together and talk about the community and talk about the future of the area. So I kind of hosted different kind of making and eating sessions. So another thing that I do quite a lot is I create spaces where we can talk and eat. Find eating is a good tool for getting people together and talking. So this project has been, you know, really getting people to think about what works and what doesn't work in their area, and generating lots of imagery with people in the area, which is a kind of positive story for the area. And then, so I've done a number of workshops. This was a workshop we did where each person did themselves as a house, and then it kind of creates a street. But all of the different workshops I ran were all about kind of creating this space and trying to kind of create the future idea that the community can meet together, and setting a precedence for community meals. Something I learned quite quickly about the area is that because it's been deprived and there hasn't been much in terms of kind of outside support coming in, there haven't been many projects going on, the community have tended to be quite kind of insular and self-sufficient. So they would do things like, you know, what they call bring a plate, where you all meet up and everyone brings a plate of food, and then that's the meal. And so my project is all based on that. So all of the imagery that we were creating over the summer is now being used to kind of create designs which will eventually go onto a community ceramic, which everyone will have in their house you know, a plate that everyone can now start to use in the future for this kind of bring a plate community maker meal precedents which I'm setting up. So this project continues now, and it's been really interesting for me as an artist because, as I said, usually I have this distance between me and the people I'm working with, whereas with Community Maker I'm working with my neighbours and everyone knows who I am now, and I've got to live here for well, the agreement is you have to live here at least for 5 years and you can't sell your house for 10 years. So it's really interesting to suddenly be kind of really invested in a location and being kind of required to use my skills as a community member and as a resident and a kind of citizen. Weirdly, from this project, the council were kind of saying, "Why are you in that tent? You know, why? You know, you can't be in a tent all the while. Whenever, you know, what about when it gets to winter?" So since then, they've kind of offered me this pub, this empty pub, and they've said, "Anna, do you think you could get the community to think about how we can, you know, take on this pub?" So again, it's kind of this strange outcome where it's changing the council's way of kind of working and getting them to kind of look at the gap themselves and think about how, you know, how can we get people involved in filling that gap. So I've just got a couple more minutes, so I just thought it'd be really good to quickly sort of say about, you know, when you're starting out, you might think, you know, how do I start to build up a profile myself? So, you know, you're all here, so that's a really good start. You've already kind of started on that, and I'm sure you're all kind of getting involved sort of locally and regionally already. But I would say it's really important to sort of join networks and groups and take part in as many events and opportunities as you can. And that's something I always do. I always kind of do my best to get out locally and regionally and nationally. So make sure you kind of, you know, visit your local galleries and make sure they know who you are. Be connected to things like Turning Point West Midlands and New Art West Midlands, and also things like Artist Newsletter. And I just thought, just to show you from, you know, one thing can lead to lots of other things. So in 2008, I went on a trip to Lille with Artist Newsletter, and I met this group of people. And this was just a one-off trip for about 3 days. And I gave things out to people with my details on, and I gave them some of my multiples. And then from that trip, I ended up being commissioned to do an artwork, doing a residency with an exhibition, creating an event and developing a resource, membership in a network, inclusion in a publication, and also organisational development. So lots of things came from this one thing. So I just want to kind of demonstrate that, you know, think about your practice as, you know, something which is kind of ongoing, and it's really, really key to always kind of be connected to people. I'm running out of time a bit, so kind of just really quickly. So in 2006, I moved back I'd been back in Stoke for about a year at that point, and I didn't really have much of a network there, and I was asked to to curate a show with Airspace Gallery. And then in 2007, I was involved in a professional development opportunity. But around that time, I was applying for loads and loads and loads of opportunities. I was applying for all sorts of things, residencies, exhibitions, and I was sending out loads and loads of things. And I was getting quite frustrated. I started to keep a spreadsheet of, you know, how long, this isn't my spreadsheet, I didn't keep the spreadsheet, I just put that on as an example. You know, how long did it take me to do that, and what did they ask for? And it was actually really frustrating because I wasn't getting the things I was applying for, and I didn't know why. So I decided I'm just going to create my own opportunities now. So I decided that 2008 was going to be called the Year of Finding Spaces in the City for Art, where the city becomes a test bed for new ideas. And I decided that each month I would do at least one thing, and that might be an exhibition or an event, or I might do a research trip or something like that. But I think importantly, I started a blog too. So from that one task that I set myself, by the end of the year, I had 47 blog posts detailing research visits I'd done to all sorts of places. And wherever I went, I kind of made connections with people, and I kind of talked to them about what they were doing and then what I might be able to do with them. I also had exhibitions in Stoke and Bristol. I took part in a radio debate and did some residencies, one in a council house in Liverpool, which was really interesting. I took part in a publication, and I did the thing where I became a dating agency director. I did some small commissions at first. I did a £1 commission, £1 again, where I just went and planted some seeds on a brownfield site. But then by the end of the year, I was starting to get bigger commissions and people were giving me, you know, a bit more trust, and I'd started to build up a profile. I was commissioned as part of Whole Latitude Art Festival and selected for an exhibition in Aberdeen. And then I also created a publication on how to turn your house into a gallery. And at the end of the year, I received a 6-month research bursary to enable me to carry on working for 6 months. So I just kind of wanted to demonstrate that if you kind of take control of your practice and you think, instead of waiting for other people to give you opportunities, really see the next year for you as a land of opportunity and kind of set yourself some goals, maybe monthly goals. You know, you might be studying now, but you could still be taking part in and organising arts events locally. And I do think that through kind of curating things and organising things yourself, it's a brilliant way of kind of, you know, expanding your network. Apply for and create opportunities that are relevant to you, but be strategic about them. And think about whether or not they start to build a profile that makes sense to other people and that people can start to recognise the way that you work. Have a plan about where you want to be by the end of the year. Do your research, go on visits, make connections. And yeah, realistically, after graduating, you are going to have some kind of paid job alongside, but that's fine, you know, as long as you're still keeping that practice going underneath. Have a web presence and do your best to be generous to everyone, all of the other artists around you in the groups. I think however you do it, in whatever way, make sure that you do work with other artists, because working with others is really good. So I just wanted to finish with that really. My blog now has been going since 2008 and has quite a lot on it now. You can have a look if you want to know more about any of those projects, and also the gallery address there too. But thank you so much everyone for listening, and I hope that there were a few things in there that might have been of interest. I hope to come back and visit your degree show. Yeah. Thanks, Michelle.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.